Hello, everyone. My name is Adam Calo. I'm a postdoctoral researcher studying the way land tenure shapes food systems interventions at the James Sutton Institute in Scotland. And the motivation of this panel is to raise the profile of land reform or land reparation efforts that are nonetheless taking place in countries where the right to private property is a strong virtue and appears sacrosanct in the law and in cultural norms. We hear, especially in this conference, so much how secure land tenure is a prerequisite for agroecology and other land use visions. And this session is about the how of shaping new land access regimes. We'll hear from active efforts to reshape our relation to land as a prerequisite to bring about food systems change from Scotland, from the USA, and France. I'll ask each speaker to introduce themselves, but to first really set the stage, I'm going to ask Joe Guldi, who is an associate professor of history, who has long been beating the drum about the way property relations lie at the heart of social and ecological reform aspirations, to speak. So I'll pass it to you, Joe.
Joe has left the room.
Okay. We lost Joe for a second. So let's see if we can get her back.
Okay. Well, is it possible to go on to James and back to Joe?
Yes. Let's skip to James if he's ready, and then we'll just change the order up a little bit. So first we'll hear from James, who is on the spot, is going to talk about directly into the case with no preface about what's happening in Scotland.
Yeah, so thanks, Adam. Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. I am James McKessick-Leach. I'm a policy officer with the Scottish Land Commission, based in Inverness, although based at home at the moment, given current circumstances. I'm going to give you a kind of whirlwind tour of Scottish land reform up to the present date and some of our work, particularly in terms of agriculture, but also looking ahead to some of the more exciting things and interesting things that we're going to be doing. So land reform in Scotland has a quite a long history, actually. As you can see, all goes back to the Common Good Act of 1491, which is arguably the first piece of land reform legislation in the country. And that act is still in force. So definitely a precedent set more than 500 years ago. More recently, though, we have a range of land reform and agricultural legislation, particularly in the early part of this century. There was quite a lot of activity when the new Scottish Parliament was formed in 1999, quite a flurry of activity then. And then that's continued on through 2015 and through the Land Reform 2016 Act, which is the underpinning one for a lot of what we're doing and introduces some of the more interesting aspects of Scottish land reform at the moment. Now, land reform in Scotland is quite an emotive subject as well. Many of you may be familiar with particularly the Highland clearances, the forced removal of people from the Highlands and Islands of Scotland in the name of progress, in the name of development, and in the name of sheep farming. And that legacy is very much with us today and shapes the culture and attitudes of a lot of people in the country, and also that feeds into the politics and then into the legislation. Concentration of ownership is the large issue, the main issue that we have to deal with in Scotland. Some of you might have heard, particularly if you're south of the border, that 1% of people in England own half the land in England. Well, in Scotland, it's 1% of 1% of the people of Scotland. So less than 500 people own half the privately owned land in Scotland. So concentration of ownership is a really critical issue here. But I think one fundamental thing is that for us, reform is a process, it's not a goal. We're never going to reach a stage where we can sit back and relax and say, land reform is done, we can move on. So the Land Reform 2016 Act, as I said, is one of the most powerful ones and introduces a number of interesting aspects. So one of them, of course, is the Land Commission, which I'm grateful for because it gives me a job in land reform, which is quite a rare thing in the world. But it also introduces the Land Rights and Responsibilities Statement, which is an articulation of what the Scottish people of the Scottish Parliament believe land is for. And it outlines in principle, in 6 principles, what those rights are that people have in terms of land ownership and management and use, but also the responsibilities for the people who exercise those rights. And it is, in that sense, quite a world-leading statement of intent. The other thing that the Land Reform Act introduces is a community right to buy that is not a preemptive right like the previous 2003 version, but is actually a forced sale where a community can demonstrate a greater aim towards sustainable development in the current landowner. That's only came into force in the last year or so, so it hasn't yet been tested through the courts, but the potential for that as a transformational tool for community land ownership is quite significant. The Commission itself, we have a vision, as you can see there, and our objectives are very much around productivity, diversity, and accountability. And I think anyone kind of watching this will understand that these are very much three areas that are quite lacking in how land is owned, managed, and used at the moment. Productivity is questionable, diversity is certainly absent, and accountability is missing a lot of the time as well. At the moment, we have 4 priorities of work. We published our new strategic plan just a few months ago, and I'll go through some of these in more detail. But I think one of the other things to note is, although we are a public agency, it's really important for us to get out and about, to send our message to the people, to discuss with people, to have public events, and to really engage with the Scottish public and take on board their views on land reform, what their issues are, and what we need to be addressing. I think for us, there is that option as a public agency to sit in an ivory tower and produce disconnected policy, but it's really important for us to get out there and really understand what's going on in the country. So agricultural holdings is a large chunk of our work. We are home to the Tenant Farming Commissioner, who is essentially an ombudsman for the tenant farming sector and is there to fulfill a role of improving landlord and tenant relations. And he does that by issuing codes of practice and guidance notes for legislation, and tries to essentially ensure that relationships within that sector are much improved, because historically they have been quite difficult in parts. And the other element around this side of work is land access. So looking at barriers to entry and taking measures and instituting policy to increase availability of land for new entrants and for progressing farmers in Scotland. So many of these barriers are things that you'll probably be familiar with, things around land values, being unaffordable and totally out of kilter with agricultural use. Succession planning is something that we find is a real barrier, particularly for smaller owner-occupiers who don't have an obvious successor. And again, tax and subsidy regimes are something that play a crucial role, quite a huge role in the land market, and are very heavily responsible for squeezing progressing farmers and small farmers out of the market altogether. So some of the ways that we've come up with to address this, we've published a guide to joint ventures. So this is, as we sometimes say, Tinder for farmers, essentially. Oh, that's the next one. Sorry, that's land matching. So I was getting ahead of myself. But essentially, this highlights the opportunities for new entrants and for existing farmers as to how they can work together, and a number of legal frameworks in the Scottish context that you can do that through. The land matching service, this is the Tinder for farmers. So essentially, it might be a great idea. You might be really interested in taking on a joint venture or working with someone, but how do you find that person? So this is a facilitated service that we've set up in partnership with the National Farmers Union in Scotland, along with the Scottish Government. And it brings those different parties together, and it is that facilitated matchmaking service that aligns people's aspirations for businesses and for opportunities. And so far, that's been in its first year. We've had 4 successful matches already, and we're looking for more next year. So we're off to a pretty good start with this, we think. And then finally, farm business incubators. So very much paralleling business incubators in other sectors, but this is an area where Scotland is perhaps behind the curve on some of these measures, and we've drawn a lot of inspiration from France and from the USA on farm business incubators, and it's something that we're going to be working on over the next couple of years. Prior to the COVID outbreak in the early last year, we had some really positive initial discussions with public landowners, and those have kind of stalled because of the COVID pandemic, but we're hopefully going to pick those up later this year. Briefly touching on reforming land markets, one of the things obviously I touched on earlier was around land values. The influence of tax and fiscal policy can't be underestimated, and particularly if you look at the estimated value of UK land, it's £5 trillion. We're simply not getting a return on that, and it's being used, like land is being used in a way that is unproductive. So very much part of our work is to look at the wider issues of tax and fiscal policy and start to make suggestions about how that can be reformed. So a couple of the things there around land value capture and land value tax we're very much actively working on at the moment. And again, looking at the opportunities, particularly in Scotland and the UK, for post-cap subsidy regimes agriculture as to what we can actually use to support productivity in a more progressive manner. Embedding responsible land ownership and use is another theme. In particular, I think it's really worth highlighting land use partnerships. This is something that has been talked about for quite a while in Scotland. And we do have a national overarching land use strategy that provides a kind of outline framework for them. But it wasn't until the Climate Change Act and the declaration of a climate emergency by the Scottish Government and Parliament last year that this really took off and really had a focus on what we need to do in the contribution of land use to climate action. So there's a really interesting opportunity there, because it's still very early days, to really get stuck in. If you're in Scotland, if you're concerned about land use, if you have any ideas, to find those first mover organizations, or to even make a bid, to take on a partnership, and really shape how this would work at the regional level. And then finally, there's reforming land rights. As I touched on earlier, the concentration of land ownership has been a huge issue in Scotland for a number of years, and is the foremost issue in our land reform debate. But what we've found is, particularly in the Scottish context, is not so much about the scale of ownership, but it is that concentration of power. And I think, although I recognise that this forum in particular has quite a radical tint to it, one of the interesting things about our work is that we can use prevailing economic theory against the prevailing economic circumstances in terms of paralleling that concentrated ownership scenario with the monopoly policy that's in place in other sectors of the economy. And that's something that we found is a really powerful argument for our work, and to move the land reform debate forward, is by drawing that clear parallel of monopoly control and market power and all the disadvantages that creates in the kind of capitalist free market theory, and say, well, actually, hang on a minute, this is exactly what's happening with land at the moment. So therefore, the tools that we can perhaps use to address some of those issues are some of the ones around public interest tests on transfers and acquisitions, reviews of large land holdings, concentrated land holdings, those sorts of actions that are perfectly normal and well regulated in other sectors of the economy, or perhaps not so well regulated, but they could be. So we've come up with some recommendations there, as I've mentioned, around the public interest test. I think as well, it's worth noting that as well as statutory recommendations, there are those that are perhaps lower down, so kind of policy ones, as well as good practice. There are plenty of landowners who are trying hard to work through the current system and to find different ways to do things, but there really isn't a lot of support and a lot of examples for them to follow. So very much encouraging landowner leadership and good practice is a significant part of our work. And that's it, that's the whirlwind tour. So I will hand over to Neil, I think, who's coming up next.
Thanks, James. Do we want to go to Joe, actually, since Joe's back?
Hi, Neil. Thank you so much for that. And sorry, everyone, for getting a little lost in the interwebs. I'm glad to be back with you. So many people attending this talk might have been attracted to the world of food issues because they were aware of some local farmers market. And so I want to just start off by thinking about, in a sense, we're united here because we're interested in a kind of utopia. We're interested in a kind of utopia that we've already seen realized. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, when I was young, it was much less frequent than it is today to see small farmers making a living for themselves, selling heirloom vegetables and ancient medicine in the local square in cities in North America and across Europe. And there's been a real push. There's been a real push to make those forms of patrimony survive. And I love it and you love it too. But this panel will invite you to peek under the hood of the food market, to ask what's going on. Look there and you'll discover that most of the farmers at the market inherited land or the means to secure land. They inherited it from their families who had certain privileges. And their seeming self-sufficient lifestyle is completely out of reach to the farm laborer or the immigrant who works for them. Now, why is this true? Well, one of the clearest answers is the one theorized in the 19th century by the American journalist Henry George. George was living in San Francisco when the gold rush town represented one terminus of westward migration for American settlers, motivated by cheap land, now stripped of the indigenous population through genocide. And that land was made available to white settlers by the US government under our Homestead Act. Within a generation, However, the United States government would donate an enormous quantity of that available land for designated for small farmers, not to small farmers, but to the railroad companies. Millions of acres of land would become the property of railroad barons who would achieve further riches by selling it at a markup to new white settlers. So what George glimpsed as a journalist living through that episode of history and writing about it was this: there's no ceiling on how fast or how far the price of land can appreciate. The price of land rises and meets available bidding. Thus, railroad companies could bid for Western lands, and railroad barons could capture real estate in San Francisco. They won when they bought cheap, and they won even more when the land value appreciated. Buy land, they're not making any more of it, became the adage. So it was a mantra, that became a mantra for investors, for absentee landlords, and later for the exclusion and eviction of tenants who couldn't afford the new price. So George was quick to think about land as a limited resource and land theft as a mechanism of tyranny. He began to theorize mechanisms for holding the value of land steady, like the land value taxation that we just heard James talking about as part of the Scottish Land Commission. We have strong recipes for thinking about how to make land and housing and agriculture and economic opportunity that depends on affordable land, affordable to all participants in society. Maybe the chief most contribution of George to that discourse was something he called redistributing the benefit, which means, in plain terms, taxing the richest neighborhood in town and using the returns of that social value of land to build infrastructure, roads, sewers, train lines to the slums or to further rural communities. Now, that's of course not the world that most of us live in, where poor folk take 3 buses to work and sewers flood the bridge after every heavy rain in the part of town where minorities dwell. Most of us don't live in a world where taxes are levied on rich neighborhoods so as to pay for world-class education in the slum. But theories about land value and about its highest and best use have a great deal to give to our increasingly divided world. Land value appreciation explains a lot about why farm laborers can't buy their own property, even in rural or remote areas. And even more importantly, there are implications of a theory of equity around land value for other domains. In the world of housing, even in the world of climate change, theories of land value taxation suggest how we can both enjoy strong private property rights and set ambitious goals for survival on the planet. So the speakers on this panel represent 3 dimensions of action around land issues in the global north. And so I'll turn back over to Neil next, and then I will probably pop on for a couple of moments, giving the historian's perspective on these exciting developments. Thank you very much. Over to Neil.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Adam, for inviting me to be on this panel. Good morning, evening, afternoon, wherever you are. My name is Neil Thapar, and I co-founded Minnow a year and a half ago after spending the better part of a decade working towards structural change in the food system as a lawyer and advocate. And together with my co-founder, Mai Nguyen, we've both experienced the food and farming system here in the United States kind of inside and out. And what we found is, as Joe talked about, is that any reform that we worked towards that didn't include land relations never really amounted to much change at all. And so we kept coming back to land, who owns it, how they own it, how they've come to own it, and also, as important, how people who don't own land or have the security that land ownership represents are faring in our society. And while we focus on land, our core work, we realized, is really about increasing a sense of belonging in a place where people have been made to not feel like they belong. And that there's a long history of that in the United States, and it primarily is divided along racial lines. And so our focus as an organization and as a kind of people working towards land reform is to focus on solutions that are by and for Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. So just to put a fine point on what Joe was sharing, that history, that trajectory has led us to a place where now, maybe many of you have heard this statistic already, but 98% of farmland in the United States is controlled by white people. And the flip side of that is that about 60% of the labor, people whose hands are actually in the soil, are people of color. And the distribution and governance of land is central to how we've come to be and in this place and where we need to go. But before I want to talk about minnow, I just want to acknowledge that for me, a lot of what I've learned as sort of solutions to the problem of private property, which for me is at the heart of the land access challenges in the agricultural system, are concepts and practices that have a long history within indigenous communities, both here in what we now call the United States and around the world. And so while we center perspectives, non-native perspectives of the global north in this conversation, for me, a lot of what I draw from notions of democratic governance, community control, cooperation, the sort of distinction between land use and land tenure are traced back to a long-standing history of indigenous knowledge and practice. So I want to start there. And also, I want to take the opportunity to, as the son of Indian immigrants whose family comes from Punjab, just sort of share as this during this platform, the sort of and uplift the protests that are happening for the last couple of months in India against the deregulation of markets there. And you know, there's 2 million farmers, more than the number of farmers that even exist in the United States, that are protesting right now. And the Indian Supreme Court recently held off the implementation of that law while negotiations continue. And so just uplifting the sort of farmers there, particularly women who have been leading protests, but also sort of doing all of the other invisible work to make the protests possible. Okay, so what I want to talk about is just to start with a kind of like thinking of how to think about private property and the change that's possible, as opposed to how difficult it might seem, and then talk a little bit about minnow and talk more in detail about that in the Zoom session afterwards if people have questions. But a lot of conferences like this that I attend, I often hear a refrain that our food system is broken, and so we need to fix it. And I want to just say that it's not. It's working exactly how it's supposed to be. It may not be working for many of us, but it's working exactly how it was set up. And that's true as well for our land tenure system in the United States. And it's important for me to say this because when we think that something is broken, the response is that we need to fix it, which suggests that we just need to work around at the margins, maybe more funding for local marketing schemes, or reforms to crop insurance policy, or more beginning farm incubator programs that are important changes, but on their own don't address the root causes of the structural inequality that is baked into our land tenure system and then our food system as a result. And so what I want to invite us to think about is that it's not actually broken. So then what's the solution? And I'd offer that the solution is that we need to break it. and that opens up a possibility of imagination of the tools that we can use, because you have to think outside the box if something needs to be broken. Maybe consider questioning, if not breaking, the rules of the game as they exist. And for me, in the context of land, I think the fundamental question that this panel is asking is that land can be and is used as a commodity, just as any other sort of item that can be bought and sold in the marketplace. And if we want to truly make land equitable in terms of access and ownership, that we need to dismantle both the legal and cultural attitude that makes that the case. And I know it sounds politically unthinkable, and in part that's precisely why it needs to happen, because the politics of land are recent, and they are the result of sort of a legal fiction. They are not a divine right that we maybe are brought up in this country to believe. And so that's what Minnow is about in many ways. For a long time, I've spent, time working on legislation or passing public policies. And what I've learned from those experiences is that public policy always follows public opinion, never the other way around. And so with Minnow, what we want to do is change the culture of how we view land relations in the US to awaken our imagination of what's possible at a time when land is so consolidated, increasingly by agribusiness and by financial actors. It may seem that the land is never going to become free again. And so I think it's important for us, and what our role is at Minnow, is to open up those windows of possibility so that we get inspired to fight for more of it. And who we're fighting for are immigrants who come here who are farmers and suddenly get turned into farm workers in the United States, or refugees who have to leave their ancestral homelands in large part because of Western imperialism, but leave behind their foodways, their seeds. For Black and brown youth who have been dispossessed not just from their land historically, but also from their connection and from their relationship to the earth. So this is the sort of sense of belonging that is missing when we don't have a relationship with the earth that is one that's free and that's consensual. So how are we working towards land reform in the US through Minnow? Mainly by demonstrating that it's possible now, even within the legal system that we have and the constraints as we build towards something different. I often think about a quote from our friends at Movement Generation, which is to say that what the hands do, the heart learns. So we want to embody the practice of collective ownership as a tool for building our capability then and our imaginations to then demand for the kind of legal and structural change that will follow, that will make it more widespread. So we're supporting the development of community land trusts, of cooperatives as models for land stewardship, and mainly by and for, again, communities of color, because even that space of community land trusts in the United States has been dominated by white-led organizations, even though those roots of the community land trusts in the US trace back to the Black rural South. So sort of creating space for communities that again haven't even been able to sort of be included in the models of collective ownership, at least in the mainstream. Changing culture relates to the work to return land to indigenous communities. This is an act of repair and the first step in sort of recognizing the truth of the history of our land relations, so we can be clear about what the future holds. And our role in this is to sort of build on and deepen the relationships that we have with indigenous communities in California to facilitate the transfer of land into indigenous hands. And then lastly, we want to eventually work towards a society where land is not seen as a commodity. And what is the one fundamental aspect of something that's a commodity is that it can be bought and sold. And so how do we move towards a place where land is never resold again? And the challenge here is that land in the US context and maybe in other Western context as well has always been the speculation of profit from land has been the sort of engine of wealth creation, and at the same time dispossession, depending on who you were. And for as long as land is the primary driver of financial wealth, we're not going to have land democracy, because we're not going to be able to compete with the sort of capital that moves, that's borderless, and that moves as much faster than any of us can. So what we're working towards is, increasing the profile of gifts of land and of purchases without debt. These are the tools that can make land both affordable and accessible, but also be held and never resold again. And this is where I think we need to broaden our scope of who we work with in our movements. Because it's not, land reform by itself is not going to replace the cash that farmers need at the end of their careers to retire. So we need to embody a broader sense of racial and economic justice to actually care for people if they're not able to speculate on that profit, which farmers historically have had to do because farming is not a profitable endeavor for farmers that are growing food for people. Then what are the other ways that we're caring for people who are not going to be able to build financial wealth that traditional way, because it's a losing battle on the whole for most of us. So I'll happy to talk more about Minnow in the breakout room. And to close, I think I just want to offer a quote from Grace Lee Boggs that kind of speaks to the moment that we're in here in the United States, with sort of questions about what democracy is in the last couple of weeks, if not the last several years, but also as a principle for how to move forward with thinking about land reform and what that means. So it goes, "We need to go beyond opposition, beyond rebellion, beyond resistance, beyond civic insurrection. We don't want to be like them. We don't want to become the political class to simply change presidents and switch governments. We want and need to create the other alternative world that is now possible and necessary. We need to exercise power, not take it." And with that, I'll leave it and pass it to the next speaker. Thank you. I can't hear Morgan. I don't know if anybody else can.
No, Morgan, we're not able to hear you. If you can go to the bottom of the screen and check that your camera mic settings says cam/mic, be sure that your proper mic is selected. I'll bring up Adam too.
Morgan's just trying to adjust her microphone settings, and then she's going to try and speak.
If you go to the audio tab on the settings page, you can check that the right mic is chosen.
Still can't hear you, Morgan.
Just to reiterate, there's a gear icon at the bottom of the screen. It says cam/mic. And if you click on that, it'll be in the settings page. Go to the audio tab, and you can check out your mic settings. Adam, in the meantime, would it be good to...
What if we, if Severin, do you want to talk for a little bit? And then Morgan, once you can send us a chat once you're ready to come back in.
Okay, I'll bring Severin.
Hello, hello? Am
Yeah.
I on?
Yeah, Severin, we can hear you. You're on.
Hi. Wow. So first of all, thank you to all of you for participating, and I am so grateful to be in a community praxis mode with other people who are thinking about land reform and workshopping the ways and the approaches kind of behaviorally, legally, historically. And I really welcome the beginning of a new phase of this collaboration, where we have such amazing co-actors and stakeholders working together to collaborate on this practice. Because as I drive around in the world and look at the landscape and think about all the climate change that is predicted and the consequences that we face in all of our working landscapes, beyond the vegetables and beyond the kind of farm acres of the organic movement, there's so much work to be done. And in a sense, until we're liberated to do the work of repairing and restoring and refurbishing our living systems' capacity to function, I'm talking about our river systems, our hydrologic systems, our uplands, our drainage, our infiltration, our hydrology, to buffer and allow these living systems on which farms are a part and on which human settlement is a part, then we can't really face the challenges. I have to go outside because I'm. Woo! This is the part of being an informal user of an internet commons. And so, in that sense, you can't liberate ourselves to do the work and be agents of the recovery of life of these living systems until the land is liberated, until we are liberated to be in relationship with the land. So I'm coming as a co-founder of Agrarian Trust, and actually Neil was the lawyer who was the leader at the Sustainable Economies Law Center who helped carry that work forward from a problem-solving set of humans who were interested in how to get access to land for incoming young farmers, predominantly white young farmers from predominantly white older farmers, landowners, because that's the context in the United States. And that work has evolved and become Agrarian Trust, which now is a community land trust held by a nonprofit, bringing land into permanent commons and making it available on 99-year leases to those who will grow food for community for community food security. That has taken many years to carry out and is, designed by its practitioners, like designed by its stakeholders, by the young farmers and by the exiting farmers to meet their needs. And of course, it's limited by capital. We've got to line out the door of farmers who want to be able to retire gracefully and, with a bargain sale of their land. And we've got a line, coming in the door of young farmers who'd like to take over the operations of our current organic movement, which you could say those guys have been feeding us. They've been feeding the movement for 40 years. And now, they deserve to be able to retire in dignity. And many of them would like to do that in a commons oriented way. But is there cash on the table to facilitate that? Well, I would say not yet. And that's part of our next organizing challenge, is to build the cultural desire and the strength of mobilizing the financial capacity to arrange for the cash to join the party. And that the many ways that capital flows, as you know, a wonderful friend of mine has raised dozens and dozens of millions of dollars to make an app that helps people go camping on the weekend. And so it's so interesting that you could raise hundreds, you could raise many millions very easily to provide access temporarily for a shelter overnight for those with wealth, but you're not able to have affordable housing and affordable land as a cultural priority in this society. My job in this panel, is Morgan already working? I'm going to keep talking until I'm told that Morgan's ready. Because my job in this panel was to bring the conversation from these different cases of experimental land reform in its different emergent. It's like we're in this time of emergent and new cultural approaches, new what they would call customary rights, emergent customary rights, where in all the world, especially in Africa, especially in and these are highly contested frameworks where you have cultural expectations and customary rights frameworks that are totally embedded in millennia of human experience. But it's more in these Western European contexts where we're having to kind of continue the 19th century land reform movement that Joe is reminding us about, that was the kind of anti-imperialist Gandhian tradition, and in Scotland, the Napier reports, and Henry George in the US, this kind of counterpower. So it's like we're this cluster of exemplar practitioners in the counterpower tradition, and as Neil is saying, drawing from the larger spirit of commons-based human land interaction, governance, shared spiritual economy, shared ritual and practical feedback loops of governance and care and belonging and safety and sustenance. And so that's the kind of merger of blobs that this little panel represents. And I really hope that this is just the first of many, many conversations, and I'm craving to work with Adam to organize and others on this group to organize a panel of many panels.
Severine.
Oh, are we done?
Just wanted to let you know that Morgan is ready to speak. Just
okay, let's let Morgan speak, and then I will come back.
Morgan,
Hi.
you're on. Hi.
Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Well,
Yes.
great. Well,
Sorry.
it's not always easy in rural areas to have internet really working. So my name is Morgan Odi. I'm a farmer in Bretagne, Western France. I grow vegetables. I'm also involved in the land commission within Confédération Paysanne. So that's our farmers or peasants organization. And yeah, I want to talk about the French experience of land reform, which hasn't been using this word. Actually, after World War II, France experimented a land reform without ever saying that it was one. But in only a few decades, the land, which was very largely controlled by the gentry, passed under the control of farmers. And this was done in the context of the Communist Party very strongly challenging the government, pushing it to implement policies to redistribute land and other very social reforms. So the first important reform was new rights for the tenants, as it has already been said. At that time, more than 80% of the land was owned by landlords from the aristocracy, and a large majority of the farmers were either tenants or sharecroppers. And the first law was to improve the rights of the tenants and forbidding sharecropping. The only way a landlord could break the tenancy contract would be if himself, most of the time it was himself and not herself, or his own children would work the land, which for the gentry was very rare. So this law imposed a 9 years tenancy, which was renewable automatically. And if the landlord would sell the land, the tenant would have the priority to buy it. The law also introduced a very strong regulation on the price of tenancy. It's still today, it's quite low if you compare it to other European countries. It's between 100 euro to 150 euro per hectare and per year. And still today, most of the French farmers are tenants. They are not landlords. So this regulation about tenancy is very, very important. The second tool, which has been created in the 60s, is maybe the one that you know best. It is called Thapar. It's actually Thapar. It's a private company, but with public competencies under the control of public administration. And it collects information about the selling of land. When you sell land in France, you have the obligation to inform Thapar. And Thapar has the capacity to break the selling of a piece of land and attribute it to someone else who is considered more priority. It can also break the land, the selling, if Thapar considers that the price is too high. If the price is above the average price of land in one region, then it can say, no, you can't sell at that price. You've got to reduce the price. So the general idea is to take the opportunity of the changing of land owner to direct the land towards people with higher rank of priority. The third tool is much less known, but we consider that it is actually the most interesting. It is called contrôle des structures in French, so control of structures. It's not very clear. The idea is that whatever is your status towards a piece of land, you need a legal authorization to use it. So whether you are the landlord, the tenant, or have no relation with this of property with this land, you will need an authorization to use it. I just give you an example. One of my neighbor, she has a small farm of 19 hectares that was first bought by Thapar, and she was given the priority. So she has goats and produces cheese with the milk. And another plant of 1 hectare was on sale some years ago, just next to her farm. So she immediately sent a request for land use authorization. So she sent that to the administration. And at the same time, she was discussing the price with the landowner. But other farmers, bigger and wealthier, proposed to the landowner a higher price for the plot. Yet, my neighbor, she because she was recently settled and had a small farm, and because the plot of land was very close from her own farm, she was given the use authorization. And so the bigger farmers, they put pressure on her to surrender this authorization use, but she was very strong and she refused to give up authorization. And so in the end, competitors gave up, because even if they could have bought the land, they would never have been allowed to use it. So this is a strong tool to make sure that the people with more, which we consider with more priority, have access to land use. So I told you about the beautiful face of these policies, yet they have lots of limits. It has been very effective in the 50s, 60s, 70s. Yet now we see that this policy also faces several weaknesses in the current context. First, this policy has really greatly strengthened the power of what we call the farming family, which is old people traditionally involved into farming. So it means that if you are new entrants, it's far harder to get land. And one other problem is that it has given lots of power to the biggest farm organization, which is called FNSEA, which is like your NFU in England. And so of course they will give more priority to their friends than to organic small farmers. So this is one of the big problem. The other problem is that we have had very neoliberal governments in France as well. And so they are reducing the number of civil servants. And these policies made of Thapar, I will write it on the chat. And also on control of structures, they require people to see who is owning how much land, and so who should be given the priority, to organize the meetings, because to define the priorities on all those things, then people meet all together, the people from the farmers organization, people from the municipalities, and we discuss those priorities. So it needs time for administration. And with less civil servants, we can't do the job. Another big challenge for these policies has been the new capitalist strategies which have been created to challenge this regulation. As you can imagine, many people were very unhappy about public regulation of land. at the first place landowners who rent their land, and they consider that they are not free enough to choose the tenant and that the revenues of land rental is too low. So they have been trying very hard these last years to change the law, up to now unsuccessfully, yet there is a trick to get off a tenant and possibly make more money out of a plant. So I explained to you the trick, but you don't use it. If you are a landowner, for example, a notary or lawyer working in a big city earning quite a lot of money, and you want to get rid of your land tenant, you can pretend that you will take back the farm and work it yourself. Of course, you will never do this, but you can pay an agricultural work company to work your land, and this way you will receive the CAP subsidies, and with the selling of the grain, it will be enough to pay for the work. This strategy is relevant only for cereal cropping or some farm activities that require very little workforce. It does not work for animal breeding, which requires daily activity. But so in eastern and northern France, thousands and thousands of hectares are now worked under these conditions, where false farmers who never get their boots dirty have the work done and receive the farm payments. And so for us, it is very shocking, and we want to change this. The other big problem that we have right now, which is challenging the regulation, is that all land regulation policies were created in an historical context where the landowners were people, I mean real people. And now more and more societies buy land. And it can be society made of 2 or 3 farmers, or society where the people doing the actual work aren't in control. And the French land regulation policy is powerless to control the selling of shares of society. For this reason, many people use this hole to skirt the regulation and buy or use land even if they don't have the priority. So we see that our policy is not adapted to face these new ways to get control over land. And we see now that new kinds of actors are entering the market for taking control over land, mainly big finance companies, which consider that land not as a productive resource, but as a secure financial asset. So there have been huge scandals about Chinese corporations buying farms with 3,000 hectares. But of course, French or European corporations also use this hole in the regulation. For example, with the COVID pandemic, internet companies are doing lots of money, and we have started to see them coming in the land market. Of course, they have very beautiful leaflets saying that they are dedicated for ecological farming and for helping young farmers to smart. But what they are really interested in is the investment. It is to secure the asset. So that's for this reason that we want a new law for land regulation. And actually, we are not alone to want a new law. We want a new law because we care for a fair sharing of land and for the possibility for new farmers to start. But also, for example, Thapar, the private company which can buy the land and give it back for the people with priority. If nobody sells land as such anymore, they will just die. So their business is over. So they want a new law. And there are also quite a number of economists who express their concern because when huge areas of land go under custom work or are used as an asset and not anymore as a productive resource, the result is that wealth created decreases. So you create far less wealth with 200 hectares of grain monoculture than with this land being shared between free market gardeners, 2 dairy farmers, a goat breeder, and a peasant baker. And we believe that the administration should worry too, because less wealth means less taxes. So all these people have been shouting quite a lot to ask for a new ambitious law to renovate the land regulation system. And President Macron has made the promise to do it when he was a candidate for presidency. He repeated his promise when he was elected, yet the Ministry of Agriculture never seriously started to work on this. And in June last year, it was announced that because of the COVID crisis, there would be no time for it to be discussed in the parliament before the next president election. And so we were very disappointed. And in order to calm down all the very disappointed people, the ministry then said that we could have a small law to tackle the issue of capitalist corporations buying land. So that's where we stand now. I will try to go fast. So on the control of land shares selling, MEPs are working on proposals to make sure that the selling of land through shares would go through the same control as direct selling of land. So above a certain threshold, which is very high at the moment, no selling would be possible without an authorization from the administration. A very difficult point is to calculate how much land a corporation actually controls. The idea is to use a law adopted in a few years ago at the EU level on money laundering and terrorism. And that law makes it compulsory to declare the ultimate beneficial owners of each corporation. But to be honest, we don't know yet whether it can be effective. What we know is that this would require civil servants with high level of training on knowledges in asset management to investigate into the labyrinth of corporations. Well, I hope that I have not bored you too much because this is a quite complex system of land regulation. In some countries with revolutionary context, genuine agrarian reform can be a strong ideal. Yet in many of our northern countries, if we just ask for agrarian reform, we might be very disappointed. Then working on legal system to ensure better sharing of the land can be, although it's less exciting, an efficient way to reach part of our goals. Public land regulation does not mean that individual or collective local initiatives don't have a role to play to settle new farmers. Yet the numbers are important. In my region, in Bretagne, for example, you may know Terre de Liens, which is an association which collects money from the citizens in order to buy farms. And really, they do a great job, and I love them. But they can maybe support 2 or 3 projects every year for less than 100 hectares. While with Thapar, just in Bretagne, it allows every year for about 100 new farmers to access land, including a third in organic farming, concerning close to 2,000 hectares per year. So we need citizens' involvement, but we also definitively need public policies for a better sharing of land. So thank you very much. I will try to look at the questions.
Thank you so much, Morgan. The chat window is filled with praise for how useful people are finding this detailed account of land government in France. I think you will find many, many things to latch on to. So I'm Jo Guldi, and I'm back to wrap up this panel and to draw out some connections. So I want to thank our panelists who've done such a good job of framing a diversity of issues. And I want to add some historical context. I am a historian by training. I am a historian of land reform. And I want to add, tell just 3 quick stories, make 3 quick points that will help to draw together the stories we've been hearing from our speakers. The first of those is that is a reply to Neil, but also to James, to think about land reform and race. And I want to make the point that land reform is inherently an issue about racial justice. I want to underscore that point that Neil made. So I looked very briefly at genocide as the basis for land reform in the United States, that Homestead Act. But what's even more important to know is that at the moment in time in history, when we started talking about land redistribution, taking land from the rich and giving it to the peasants from whom it had been taken, that moment of time was really a story that happens around British Empire. And it's a series of events that happens simultaneously in Scotland, Ireland, and India. So the story that Neil is telling us about people of color in both Britain and the United States today is really runs in parallel to the experience of Ireland and Scotland. So Scotland has the clearances, famously, with the crofters being evicted. Ireland has its evictions. Roman Catholics are prohibited from owning land, and then they're not prohibited, but they're charged massive rents, and they're evicted brutally using battering rams, burning down the house in the aftermath. And at the same time, India is experiencing mass displacement and even slavery, punitively high rents. This is in the 19th century. And in those three countries, there's a body of radicals and intellectuals thinking about property, who are communicating with each other. They're going back and forth between these nations. There are journalists going back and forth between Ireland and Scotland. There are legal theorists and activists going back and forth between Ireland and India. And they start to put together the pieces that the land has been stolen from all three people, and that a really mighty mechanism for reimagining justice is going to be necessary if you're ever going to be able to imagine Ireland as a place that belongs to the Irish, or India as a place that belongs to the Indians. And that's the seed of the first land reforms and rent control laws, which were passed in 1881 in the Irish Land Act. Scotland almost gets a land reform law after that. That's the crofters movement. That's the roots of the modern Labour Party. And India gets a number of land reform laws passed on the books that are never really affected, and then it looks like they're going to be affected in 1945. But the point is that land reform is born of these issues of the exclusion of people because of their race, whether that race is the Celts or Punjabis. It doesn't matter. It was understood historically to be exactly the same mechanism. So the second point that I want to make is that something happened in 1974. There's a reason, if you've never heard of land value taxation or thought about land reform as a means of correcting these kinds of injustices, there's a reason that you haven't heard of it. And there's a reason why in the US and the UK, we don't have severine and the other kinds of government mechanisms for redistributing land or treating land as a commons that Morgan was talking about in the context of France. And the reason is that in 1974, there was something like a counter-revolution in the US and the UK pretty much simultaneously. It was a backlash against forms of land redistribution and protections on the rights of tenants that had been instituted in both of those places, and a backlash against land reform movements in the post-colonial world. So 1974 is the date of a memo at the World Bank that says the US is not going to pay for land redistribution programs in India or Latin America or Africa anymore, even though those programs were at the heart of the post-colonial mission of restituting racial justice in places where white people had taken land from others. So 1974 is the moment of this backlash, and you can think of it as a moment of white power in the US because it's directed at movements to create Black agrarian cooperatives, movements to do land restitution to indigenous tribes in the United States. It's a moment when white power in the United States says, no more, we're not going to do this anymore. And in the UK, it's slightly different. I think of it mostly as an elite backlash against property taxation, an elite backlash saying, well, we're gonna take London's real estate and we're gonna make it tight to the stock market and allow it to appreciate infinitely, because you know what? We deserve a chance to rule the free market as Britain once ruled the seas. That moment of 1974 deserves to be looked at because it's the end of a lot of dreams of housing for all and farms for all and access to infrastructure for all in the Anglo-American context. So I think that 1974 date helps us to answer, this is my third point, Severine's question. Why is it so hard? Why is it so hard to prioritize affordable land and housing? We can raise hundreds of millions of dollars for the next unicorn project on the stock market. And what you need to know is that the tempo of most of history, for all of time, has been the eviction and displacement of most of the people by elites, by powers, by empires. And that it's only been for a short period of time in the 20th century when post-colonial people like the Irish, like the Scots, like Bengalis, could come together and start to imagine something like restitution of land. So we think about, you can think about that moment as creating an amazing series of mechanisms for keeping land rights or water rights in the hands of the people who live there, through land value taxation, through easements, through extension services, through rent controls, through new ideas about treating lands like a commons. There's a very ancient commons in the indigenous world, but we didn't know how to describe it legally. It's only because of Eleanor Ostrom working from the 1970s to the 1990s that we know how to describe that legally. So it's an invention, that modern commons is an invention, a priceless invention of the 20th century. So we invented something fundamentally new, like the invention of fire in the 20th century through land reform. And we have the opportunity, Scotland has this unique opportunity in the Land Commission now to catch up with where that spirit of land restitution was going before the counter-revolution of 1974 crushed it in many places, not just in North America and in Britain, but in all of the places that depended on the UN and World Bank for funding of their schemes to settle poor farmers. So this is a moment of real reckoning. And make no mistake about it, the conversation about land reform is also the conversation about immigration. It's also the conversation about development. What we do at home in Britain and France and the United States is a reflection of how we think people in Afghanistan and the Punjab should be allowed to deal with their land. And our policies are echoed by development policies our nations support. So let's think further about these questions. I think in the chat, we're going to have some links to articles. I'll share some of my articles on the history of rent control. A lot of this is new information. If you haven't heard it before, that's why. I have a book coming out in the spring of 2021 called The Long Land War that treats the history of eviction and displacement and these turning points that I'm talking about. But I think we're going to move now to a Q&A. It looks like the comments and the questions are pouring over. So we're going to move to a Q&A and you'll have all of us. Josh, do you want to tell us where to go?
Joe, this is when we're going to move to our Zoom session to do our Q&A. So in the chat, for anyone that wants to continue this conversation, the chat contains a Zoom link. If you follow that link, you'll find yourself in a Zoom room where we can continue this talk. And for you speakers, it'll be in this private chat. There's a Zoom link here.
Very good. I'm going to sign off and I'll see you in the Zoom.
It was a wonderful talk. Thank you.